Hi, I'm Tim Naftali. I'm director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. I'm in Billings, Montana. It's May 2nd, 2009, and I have the honor and privilege to be interviewing Frank Borman for the Richard Nixon Oral History Program. Colonel Borman, thank you for doing this.
You're very welcome.
Let's give a little bit of context to the viewer. Tell us who the 9 were. You were one of the 9 that came after the 7.
I was in the second group of astronauts. There were 9 of us that joined NASA in 1962. We participated in both the Gemini program and the Apollo program, and then I left in 1970 to go to a private industry. So I was with NASA for 8 years, one of the second group of astronauts.
You were in the Gemini program and did fly, I believe, Gemini 7, but
I flew Gemini 7, which was a 2-week mission, the longest mission to date that had been achieved by anybody. And then I flew Apollo 8, which was the first manned lunar circumference or lunar circling. We didn't have a lunar lander, but we circled the moon 10 times in 1968 and then came back.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about Apollo 8. You were supposed to fly something called E-mission.
We were originally planned, our mission was originally planned to be a Earth orbital mission exercising the lunar module and the command module. The lunar module was delayed a long time, and so a brilliant, in my opinion, brilliant move, George Lowe, who was the Apollo program manager, substituted a circumlunar flight for our mission because we didn't have a lunar lander.
What role did fears that the Soviets were about to
Well, the CIA had word, and the Soviets had been shooting unmanned, and even I think they even put a dog around them. I'm not sure, but they had unmanned lunar orbiting, lunar flybys, and the CIA had the information they were going to try to do it before the end of '68, and there's no question that accelerated the emphasis on Apollo 8 going to the moon, because in the final analysis, the Apollo program was a battle in the Cold War. It was not it was an age of exploration. It had all those good things. It challenged technology. It satisfied science. But it was a battle in the Cold War. It was a political move.
As an astronaut, how did you see that part of how did you see that dimension?
My major motivation, I didn't care about picking up rocks or anything else. I wanted to beat the Soviets to the moon.
Tell us, please, about you've been asked before, but I want our interview to include it. What was it like to spend Christmas Eve circling the moon?
Well, you know, one of the great things about being in the Apollo program and NASA at that time, everyone is oriented to do the mission, from the person who had the most menial job to the people who directed it. The mission came first. It was wonderful. So holidays meant nothing to us. I was away from home for 8 years. My wife raised our children. But on Christmas Eve, looking back at the Earth, our focus went from the moon, which had been obviously occupying us because we had the mission to take a lot of pictures of lunar landing sites and so on, but back to the Earth. And that was probably the preeminent memory of my journey. It wasn't looking at the moon, but looking back at the Earth. And of course, being Christmas Eve, we were alone. We were lonely. We were far away from home, and it was Christmas, so it had an impact.
Did you know before you went out there that Tranquility Base was one of the areas that was considered for the landing?
We did. We had several bases that were considered, and Bill Anders took a lot of pictures of all these potential sites.
Tell us what you recall of meeting Lyndon Johnson.
Well, I met President Johnson, I guess maybe 2 weeks or 10 days before the flight. He decided that he wanted to have a dinner at the White House, and the crew and all of us went back up to the White House and had a dinner, and he'd invited Charles Lindbergh and Jim Webb, who was the head of NASA, and it was incidentally the party took place to the great consternation of the doctors at NASA because they said, "Oh my gosh, you know, we've had you in isolation, now we're going to expose you to all these germs." But nobody got sick, and it was obviously for us a big occasion.
Tell us about meeting Charles Lindbergh.
Well, I had met him before, but he was an interesting, very, very interesting person. After the flight, President Nixon appointed both he and I to an environmental committee, and so I interfaced with him quite often. He was very inquisitive, obviously an intellectual, seemed to be interested in everything. And he wrote me, I still have a letter he wrote me from the Philippines where he was involved with early tribes, and he seemed a restless, intellectually restless person to me. I remember going on we were on a bus and people were asking for autographs and I was signing them, and he said, he said, I just wish I could do that, but I just can't do that. So he was kind of a strange person.
Which president, was it Johnson or Nixon who put you on this environmental?
Nixon.
Nixon put you on environmental. And the goal of this committee?
I'm not sure what the goal of it was, really. We looked around. I remember we went through the Bay Area Rapid Transit BART in San Francisco when it first started. I think back then he was, it may have been the beginning of the green awareness in this country. I'm not certain.
This wasn't the first time you were put on an important commission. Please tell us a little bit about the commission that investigated Apollo 1.
Well, Apollo 1 was the fire that killed 3 astronauts in January the 27th of 1967. And I was having supper at a very remote area with some friends of ours, and all of a sudden I got a knock on the door. It's a Texas Highway patrolman saying to call Houston. I did, and I was told about the fire and that I had been selected to be on the committee that investigated the fire and to get to the Cape right away. So that's exactly what I did. And then I spent, I don't know how many months we were there, 2 or 3 months. We issued a report, testified before Congress, and then I was appointed to to head a group that went to the North American plant at Downey to implement the engineering changes that were going to be made in the spacecraft to change it from the one that burned.
One of those changes had to do with the device to open the door.
That's correct. The door, the original door, the one in the spacecraft that had the fire, was a plug door, which was a lot lighter because as the spacecraft pressurized, it sealed the door. But the problem was when you got overpressurized, there's nobody in God's green earth that could open that door. So we changed it to an outward opening door that could open rather swiftly. Probably didn't need to be. That was probably an overreaction because it added a lot of weight to the spacecraft. But nevertheless, it worked perfectly, so it went fine.
Looking back at it, to what extent do you feel that this fire threatened congressional support for the continuation of the Apollo program?
I don't believe the fire threatens congressional support much at all. The American people were behind us, Congress was behind it, and the forcing function were the Soviet Union's interests in space. That was one of the beautiful parts about it, was the motivation was there, and it was in a time of really distress in the country with all of the Vietnamese problem, war problem, and the Martin Luther King's assassination. The one thing that seemed to hold together that everybody could identify with, except the extreme left, was the space program.
I've heard it. I've read that Apollo 8 was perhaps the only thing people could cheer in 1968.
I think that's right. I know after the flight, I got a telegram. We got hundreds of telegrams or thousands of telegrams, but one of them said, "Thank you, Apollo 8. You saved 1968." And I think that's about what it was. So, you have to remember also that President Johnson appointed a very astute man to head NASA, Jim Webb. He'd been Assistant Secretary of State under Dwight Atchison, Dean Atchison, and he knew the government. Technically, he was not that sharp because he was basically a lawyer and a politician. But he appointed underneath him really brilliant people. And there's only one of them still alive, Chris Kraft. But he let them do it. It wasn't a top-down. The important decisions weren't made in Washington. I've often thought that if he'd have headed the Defense Department instead of McNamara, we might have had a lot more success in Vietnam. I'm serious. And I'm really glad that McNamara wasn't running NASA because I don't think that we would have got to the moon if it would have been imposed on us. But Webb, he knew how to keep Congress in line, and he had Tiger Teague, who was a congressman from Texas, who ran the Space Committee, and he and Webb orchestrated the hearings, and it was all done very, very neatly. And Clinton Anderson, who was a senator from New Mexico, and Webb were like that. So he was a one. He never got as much credit as he deserved.
When did you first meet Richard Nixon?
I first met President Nixon, I believe, at the inauguration, when he was inaugurated. We were invited to sit at the place of honor behind him as he was sworn in, and I think that was the first time I met him.
You very soon, though, are invited to a number of events.
Well, we had been sent, actually, President Johnson arranged, or somebody in the State Department arranged for my family and myself to tour Europe. This was customary after successful flights, as the government tried to get the maximum, favorable publicity out of it. And so we went through Europe, every major country in Europe, and then came back. And one of the events at the White House, I think it was, my wife was talking to Ambassador Dobrynin, who was the Soviet ambassador, and he said something like, you've gone through Europe, but you didn't come to the Soviet Union. And I think Susan said, well, we weren't invited. Or so. Anyway, out of that came an invitation for myself and my family to visit the Soviet Union. And for that visit, we were briefed by Secretary Kissinger that he would like us to go over there and start to begin a process of involving the Soviet Union and America in joint space efforts in an effort to try to smooth relations. And so I left there with that mission in mind, and we spent a very interesting 10 days or 2 weeks in the Soviet Union.
So from that came Apollo-Soyuz.
I think that was the German, the beginning, the seed that was planted, and out of that came Apollo. So, yeah.
When you come back from Western Europe, you told Pete Flanagan, or at least he heard, that you felt that the Europeans were doing some interesting things in their space programs, and that Europeans should be involved in the U.S. space program. I believe you're one of the first to have argued that this is before the Soviets, but that the Western Europeans should be involved. Do you recall what you saw on that trip that led you to make this recommendation?
In preparing for this interview, I looked at any letters of the past that I have, and I have one copy of a letter that I wrote to Dr. Kissinger that outlined exactly what you said, and as a matter of fact, if I can make a copy of it and send it to you. I think it outlines better than I could I outlined basically what's happened, and the country has followed that procedure.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to raise it,
Yeah.
because the role that they played in the space shuttle.
Yeah. Well, and Apollo-Soyuz was, I think, a very important. I think that helped to end the Cold War. I really do. It was clear as we went over to the Soviet Union in '69, the intelligentsia there understood that their system was corrupt and flawed and wouldn't work. It was only a matter of time before it finally fell apart.
What do you recall of the tour you took with the cosmonauts when they came to this country?
Well, we invited them to come back to this country again with the approval of the State Department. And I never will forget, we met them at Kennedy, I think it was, when they came in from Moscow. We flew in a Convair prop airplane down to Washington. And they had a camera, and their son, Victor, started to take a picture out the window, and his father, oh, no, no, no. And we assured him, you can take any picture you want to. No problem, no problem. I think it was an enormous awakening for these people who had never been to this country before. A wide open society that worked.
Tell us about meeting Dwight Chapin. How did you get to know him?
Well, after we came back from the Soviet tour, I was assigned by NASA to be sort of a liaison between NASA and the White House in preparation for the Apollo lunar landing, Apollo 11 lunar landing. And so I was given an office, and I worked for Peter Flanagan in the White House, and I spent a lot of time up there in preparation for the lunar landing. So that's how I met them all at that point.
Before we talk about that part of your career, I want to check something. I'd read somewhere that you were offered the command of Apollo 11 and you turned it down.
You know, I've read that too. I had told Deke Slayton before Apollo 8 that that was my last flight, and I think that Deke knew that. I had never even been in a lunar module simulator. I had focused on rebuilding the command module. I had all the expertise I believe that anybody could have in that part of this program, but I was pretty void in the other one. And trying to become really proficient in that time period would have been very difficult. So I don't think I was ever really offered it. I don't remember that, ever being offered that.
Okay. Let's talk about your work as a liaison. William Safire, in his memoirs, talked a little bit about working with you on the RAIN plan, on what to do if, unfortunately, Apollo 11 went far wrong. Mm-hmm. What can you recall of that?
Well, you know, NASA, like any government bureaucracy, wanted to use the president's time to get the maximum positive publicity out of it. And they'd send over, we did have a contingency plan. What does the president say if there are 3 dead astronauts up there? I don't recall exactly what it was, but basically it was a bunch of mumbo-jumbo about, kind of almost finessing that 3 people were dead. And I think I suggested to Mr. Safire, maybe you ought to just say, we've got 3 people. What are you going to tell the widows? The 3 people are dead, and we ought to focus on that rather than on all of the other Folderoy.
How confident were you that the mission would succeed?
I was quite confident. I was confident that our mission would succeed, and I had enormous trust in the people that ran this program. You know, the astronauts became the celebrities. We got all the credit. But the George Lowe's and the Gil Roos and the von Brauns, these were brilliant people, and they were dedicated people. And that brilliance and that dedication seeped down, and it was shared by everybody that worked on the program. And incidentally, it was still one of those times where you were judged on your competence, not on your race or your this or that. It doesn't matter whether you were what you were. If you did your job, you were there, and if you didn't do your job, you were gone. It was a wonderful time to work for people.
What role do you remember of shaping the president's schedule around Apollo 11?
Well, the main thing I remember about I don't think I ever shaped a schedule, but I do remember I had an impact with the NASA had sent over a proposed discussion that what the president should say while he was talking to the astronauts on the moon. And it was a long deal, and I thought it was totally inappropriate. And so I wrote on the letter before we forwarded, something like, I don't recommend this or something. And I got a call to go in and see the president. And he said, well, why don't you think I ought to do this? And I said, well, Mr. President, first of all, you didn't have much to do with this. This was a Democratic program. This was, you just came into office, and I don't think you should try to take credit for it. You ought to assume that the American people deserve the credit, and also, this is way too long. You ought to be humble, and you ought to just say a few words and get off the air. And he agreed, because they threw out the other thing, and then I don't know who wrote what finally came out, but it was a lot different than what went in.
You also recommended against playing the Star-Spangled Banner and having the astronauts stand at attention.
Exactly. I think this is crazy. I mean, here you have people up there, and they should be doing their work, and they're standing at attention. Well, it went away. It wasn't patriotic. It just wasn't the time or the place.
Where where were you when Apollo 11 was launched?
I was at the White House, and with the president, and launched. Excuse
Yes.
me. I'm sorry.
So because he was supposed to go and have dinner with the Apollo 11 astronauts the day before the launch.
Oh,
He was
yeah.
going to go to Florida.
And the doctors put a kibosh on that, and that irritated me. You know, we'd gone up with Nixon, with Johnson, and had also. The doctors finally had their say on that one, and I got very irritated and publicly told I thought Dr. Chuck Berry was nuts. But anyway, I can't remember where I was at the launch. I don't believe I was at the Cape. I just don't. I remember I was at the landing, but I don't remember I was
All
at
right.
the launch.
Well,
Yeah.
let's talk about the landing then.
Well, as I said, we were at the White House then, and it went perfectly. So there was it was almost what would you say, an afterthought. Everything worked fine.
Well, although there was a little concern because Armstrong had a hard time finding a place to land.
Well, he did, and the computer had a glitch in it, but they overcame it quite easily. And
Well, where were you? Were you in the Oval? Situate us, please, in the White House. Were
I
you in the
can't
White House?
remember exactly where. I believe it was in the Oval Office. I think it
So
was.
and you were watching it on TV. Were you getting any other information from NASA, or was it just what you saw on TV?
Just what I saw on TV. Just what we saw on TV.
Do you have any memories from that of the reaction? I mean, obviously you were happy, but when all of you, when the landing occurred, what do you remember seeing? What do you remember of that?
You know, that part of I don't remember the exact word. We were related. Look, here's 8 years of work on this thing, and we won. I mean, it's like winning the Super Bowl. That was fantastic. And by this time, after the inauguration, I told you we met the Nixons at the inauguration. We were invited to have a private dinner with Susan and I with them as they were moving into the White House, and so I think I liked Mr. Nixon. I liked President Nixon. I think we had a pretty good rapport, and Susan remembers the dinner very well because about halfway through it or after it was over, Mrs. Nixon asked Susan, "Do you smoke?" And Susan said, "Oh yeah, I do." And she said, "Well, come on." They went in the ladies' room and smoked. It was it was kind of a personal thing. We were, and I thought he handled it. I liked him not only because personally, but he took my advice. So why wouldn't you like him? on the what you do when they're on the Earth, on the lunar surface.
So the landing occurs, and then the moonwalk is a couple of hours later, right?
Yes.
So
3 or 4 hours. I don't know how long. Yeah.
So you had a couple hours.
Yeah.
And then you're watching.
I can't remember whether I was with the president or not. I may have been with Peter Flanagan then. I'm not certain how that went on.
But were you there when he made the phone call?
Yes, I was there when he made the phone call. Yeah. Yeah. And he did very well. That was, to me, that was just perfect. He didn't take much time. He was very humble about it, and it worked well.
Tell us about going to the Hornet.
Well, I had to speak to the Boy Scouts in Idaho. Conflicted some way. Anyway, after that, or maybe somehow we hooked up with. I hooked up with Air Force One. I can't remember whether it was in Idaho or whether it was in San Francisco. But in any event, we flew out on the airplane, and Dr. Kissinger and the president were there, and we landed, I think, at Johnson Island, and a helicopter then took us out to the Hornet, and then the president greeted the Apollo 11 astronauts who had to be in this confinement thing. Greeted them through the window of the confinement thing, and that was I think everybody was elated then. This was a great triumph for America, and everybody, no matter how sophisticated or how urbane they were, I think they were quite elated with that flight.
What do you remember of the dinner in Los Angeles for Apollo 11? I believe you were there.
Well, that was kind of interesting too, because when they were talking about getting this dinner, I think it was at the Century Plaza Hotel, and they had invited Hubert Humphrey, who had been the head of the space program for Johnson, as the vice president of the space council. And so I said, look, you got to invite him. This is a bipartisan deal, and so they did. But it was mostly I think it was mostly a Republican audience that was invited there, and afterwards, poor old Vice President Humphrey had a suite, and nobody came. I know Pete Conrad and I went by and had a couple of drinks with him and talked to him, but he was sort of like a fish out of water at that dinner.
Tell us about Vice President Spiro Agnew.
Well, Vice President Spiro Agnew, one of the people that flew with me on Apollo 8 was Bill Anders, who became head of the National Space Council, or Space, I don't know what National Space Committee or Council. And the head of that politically was always the vice president. Johnson was, and then Humphrey, and then Agnew. And Anders would tell me that, boy, he and his people around him don't really understand or really don't care about anything. That he is if there's such a thing as a zero, you got one right here. And so I never met him, but during Apollo 13, when there was question about whether we'd get the capsule back or not, get the spacecraft back or not, there was a announcement that Spiro Agnew, who was somewhere in Iowa, was going to fly down to the
Colonel
space.
Borman, can I ask you to say that again, because I
27 minutes on this tape.